Hi, my name's Phil. I'd like to talk about politics, and in this video I've been asking Professor Stefan Wolff of the University of Birmingham about how efforts to liberate and protect Ukraine might change with the Donald Trump presidency. Stefan Wolff is a professor of international security, and if you want to hear more of his thoughts, he co-manages Navigating the Vortex, which publishes like newsletters, podcasts, things like that on geopolitics and geoeconomics. Link, as always, in the description below. Now, this video is a shortened version of the full interview. I'll be publishing the full uncut version later this week, so make sure you subscribe if you want to be notified of that. In terms of Ukraine specifically, so, I mean, there's a few things from my point of view. First of all, the Vice President-elect, J.D. Vance, has suggested a deal where Russia keeps its territorial gains, a demilitarized zone policed by European forces, and that Ukraine would have to agree not to join NATO or potentially even the EU. Wouldn't that just give more confirmation to Putin that the West is weak and he will use the opportunity, which he surely wants at the moment anyway, to rearm and reinvade later on, presumably?
I think these are all fair points. I mean, the question then is, what's the alternative? And here I think, I mean, where J.D. Vance is coming from, I think is less a perspective on Ukraine as it is a perspective on China and the need for the US to more or less disengage from Europe, potentially from the Middle East, and really throw all of its resources into the Indo-Pacific, developing relationships there with already existing and potential new partners, and really sort of confront China in the Indo-Pacific. So I think from that perspective, the deal that you have described is one that has been floating around for quite some time. There were some advisors or self-appointed advisors to Trump who circulated something quite similar earlier in the summer. And you could even go back to the presumed deal that was very close to being struck back in April, May 2022, so in the first couple of months since the invasion, which basically would have recognized more or less the front lines as they were before February 2022, made Ukraine a permanently neutral country, so no NATO membership, and probably have curbed Ukrainian military capabilities. The reason why it failed then, and the reason why it's quite unlikely to succeed now either, is that it didn't come with any credible security guarantees for Ukraine, whatever would be left of it after the deal. And that has now gotten us into another, I think, rather unhelpful conversation, which is about, well, if it's not NATO, then should Ukraine go nuclear and basically go back to, well, prior to the so-called Budapest Memorandum of 1994, and basically reactivate its nuclear program and then have a credible deterrence against a Russian defection from whatever deal is being made now by Trump.
Is the reason at the moment that we're effectively leaving Ukraine to manage its own defense, although with support? Is it still, at this point, a fear, whether on America's part or just in general, of nuclear escalation on Russia's part? Is there any credible reason why we do not actually just say, if America pulls out, then why don't we just send in European forces, which I think Poland would be quite keen on, into Ukraine to support them on the battlefield?
I think it's less the nuclear escalation that people fear, partly because, I mean, there Putin would probably get significant pushback, certainly from China, where Xi Jinping has on quite a number of occasions expressed a very strong preference for or against nuclear escalation. I think it would also be difficult for him to for Putin to manage relations with countries like India, Brazil, probably South Africa, if he deployed nuclear weapons. I think the fear is that Russia will simply escalate further a lot of the what used to be called active measures by the KGB that we have seen, in particular in Europe. So, I mean, there have been arson attacks against a warehouse in London, an assassination plot against the CEO of a major German armaments company. So, I think all of that is what in particular Europeans fear at the moment, that if they push too far, Russia will simply invest more to quite effective destabilization operations against European countries.
So because where I have a problem is I look at Russia and I see a country that has a small economy and not looking like a particularly effective conventional forces. If America said, here is the deal, and Kiev rejected it out of hand because it means, well, hang on a minute, you're allowing Russia to get away with its invasion and it will only come back for more later anyway. And it refuses to go along with it and says it will fight alone. And there will be countries such as Poland who will also recognise the threat to them. If America effectively is saying it's going to abandon its leadership of NATO, at least in this theatre, is there a possibility that more European forces just say, well, we will take the lead then? For example, does Donald Tusk say, well, we will take the lead and we will actually join Ukraine openly in battle? Is that a possibility?
Not in the immediate future. I think what we might see is more European funds being spent on defense, not just in terms of GDP proportions going into the defense budget, sort of under the NATO 2% rule, which I think Trump again is going to push quite hard for. There have been reports out this morning that the EU is now considering allowing the use of cohesion funds to be spent on security projects. That would certainly release a large chunk of money for European countries to strengthen their own defenses, in particular, sort of the frontline states, from the Baltic, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, to some extent. So all of that, I think, would be quite possible in terms of strengthening a more autonomous European defense and security capability. What I do not see immediately is Europe being in a position to ramp up its defense industrial base in such a way that it could massively supply Ukraine, in particular with air defenses, with artillery munitions. And I think there would be massive pushback both within NATO and within the EU if countries like Poland or Latvia, who have sort of talked about this in the past, were to say, well, we are actually going to send troops to support Ukraine.
Right. So essentially, I mean, from Donald Trump's point of view, it seems he wants to be this guy who, like in the last one, he said, oh, there were no wars under me. And he wants to be this peacemaker again. He says he can get a deal for Ukraine in 24 hours. He hasn't actually said how. So if Ukraine simply refuses anything that does not secure its internationally recognized borders, and if Europe backs Ukraine up, then from the other side of you, is there anything really Trump can realistically do then to that doesn't actually then start to put pressure on Russia? Can he actually get away with just abandoning the whole thing? And if he can Europe, at least while it ramps up, if it wants to ramp up any sort of capabilities, at least keep Ukraine maintaining a stalemate in the meantime?
Yeah. Okay, so I think there are sort of three different elements to that. So one is that I think from Trump's perspective, it will very much depend on who doesn't play ball with whatever his proposal might be. And it's not immediately clear that Putin would jump to the opportunity to make a deal on Ukraine now, because he is not under any real pressure right now. I mean, his forces at very high cost are still making territorial gains in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region. Very slow, but they are taking more territory from Ukraine on basically a daily basis, whether that's 10 meters or 100 meters or 1,000 meters, but it adds up over time. I think the Ukrainians are also under real pressure in the Kursk region, where they have established this little bulge after their own incursion onto Russian territory back in the summer. So I think Putin, again, is most likely going to play for time, push the Ukrainians out of Russia, thereby taking away their bargaining chip, and getting more territory in Donbass. So when Trump then actually really comes calling, Putin then has a front line that actually is more advantageous to him than what he might have now or in 2 weeks or something like that. So I think in that sense, right now, it isn't just Ukraine that is saying no, it's also Russia that is not necessarily embracing the opportunity of a Trump brokered deal. Now, if that continues until after Trump's inauguration, which is when he can actually really do something credible. I mean, he can talk about it now, he can prepare the ground, but he will only really have the power to do anything after January 20th. Then I could very well see him also saying to Putin, well, if you don't play ball, then I'm actually going to double down on support for Ukraine and really sort of force Putin to come to the table, because on the battlefield, the Russian position would then worsen. Regardless of how this plays out, the second major issue here is not so much the deal itself, but also to make it stick in the long term. And here, of course, I think people are rightly worried that Russia will not be negotiating in good faith, might just take it as a break, regroup, and start again in a year or 2 years time. So from that perspective, we are then talking about credible security guarantees. And I think here it is where Europe potentially could sort of get a foot in the door by saying to Trump, okay, we are going to make sure that there is a credible security guarantee for Ukraine. We are going to back this up with, both actual military commitments, but also political, economic support for Ukraine, but have some kind of transition phase where the Americans don't pull out immediately, and the Europeans then have to step into a void without necessarily having the capabilities to do it. So I think there is quite possibly a bargaining space here between the Europeans and the Trump administration that would sort of bridge this gap between the Americans wanting to pull out sooner, the Europeans being ready to take over later. So I think that's where also a sort of re-stabilization of the sort of transatlantic alliance could come in with more European weight and potentially less American weight, and a reorientation or a complete pivot of the US to the Indo-Pacific.
So there we are. I've linked Professor Wolff's outlet in the description below, of course, if you'd be interested in learning more. And as I've said, the full interview will be out later this week, possibly tomorrow evening, depending on what else happens. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.